Genesis begins with Adam, but creation didn't. Before Eden was planted, something older had already stirred beneath the heavens, not angel, not beast, but flesh formed without covenant. They were made, but never chosen. They walked without a name, without law, without promise. No Eden was prepared for them. No exile was required. They were not cast out, only veiled. Scripture says nothing of them, not because they failed, but because they remembered. And what remembers too much cannot be allowed to remain. God did not curse them. He silenced them. Hidden in the folds of Genesis, buried between breath and verse, they became dust again, but dust that remembers. And now, across the silence of ages, something stirs. For what was buried before Eden still breathes beneath the soil. The dust before Eden. In Genesis 1:26-27, God said, "Let us make man in our image." And he did male and female, fashioned in divine likeness. But Adam is absent. He appears only in Genesis 2. That delay isn't repetition, it's replacement. Scholars call it poetic layering, but Scripture does not echo without reason. If Adam is the first man, then who were the beings of Genesis 1? They are called mankind, but carry no name, no covenant, no breath of purpose. The Hebrew says Adam, a title, not a person. These were not Adam. They were human, but not chosen, formed, but never sealed. They walked the earth without command, without Eden, without exile. They bore no sin, only memory. And memory, in heaven, can be more dangerous than rebellion. To exist before covenant is to witness without belonging. That alone made them unacceptable. God did not curse them. He simply passed them over. No wrath, no judgment, just divine silence. They were not cast out, for they were never brought in. They were never part of the story, only the draft. Adam was shaped from dust, but so were they. The difference was not material, but breath. God breathed into Adam and into him alone. That breath was not just life, it was remembrance. Eden was not the origin of mankind, it was the origin of memory. Adam was not the first to live, he was the first to be remembered. And those before him were erased, not because they failed, but because they remembered too much. There is no death recorded for them, no genealogy, no fall, only absence. And from that absence, Adam emerges not as heir, but as substitute. He is not continuation, he is containment. What becomes of them? Scripture does not say. But silence in the Bible is not forgetfulness. It is intentional, and the dust does not forget who wore it first. They were never called very good. That declaration ends with Genesis 1:31. After that, creation shifts, man is renamed, breath is added, covenant begins, but something old remains. Buried beneath Eden, the first shaping lingers, not cursed, not condemned, only hidden. And what walked the earth before Adam still waits beneath the soil. The bloodline without a covenant. They were made in flesh, but never in promise. The first race bore no command from heaven, no law etched in stone or spirit. They walked not in rebellion, but in freedom, freedom too vast for covenant. They were not placed within boundaries, because no boundaries were drawn for them. There was no garden, no tree to avoid, no serpent to tempt. The silence of Eden was not their exile, but their absence. They did not fall, because they were never called to stand. And in that absence of law, there was also an absence of purpose, at least, in the eyes of heaven. Yet they were alive. They multiplied. They moved across a formless earth, carrying something deeper than sin, awareness, not of evil, but of origin. And in that awareness, they looked to the heavens not with worship, but with recognition. They remembered the hands that shaped them. This was the danger, for they did not forget. And memory, without covenant, becomes instability. They bore no seal, yet they remembered the source. They were unanchored reflections, fragments of divine likeness, with no place in the unfolding will of God. Adam was formed and given structure, earth, garden, order, breath. But the first race had none of these. They were raw creation humanity without containment, image without instruction. And such freedom, once awakened, cannot be molded again. So they were not destroyed. They were veiled, not punished, separated. The divine story moved forward without them, not out of vengeance, but necessity. For to offer them covenant would be to affirm a creation not chosen, and God's will required one line, not many. This is why the scriptures are silent, not because they were forgotten, but because they could not be spoken of. Their line was never named, never blessed, never cursed. A bloodline unwritten yet walked, a people uncounted yet present. They became the blood without origin, the flesh without inheritance. In the shadow of Adam's genealogy, their memory flickers not as ancestors, but as anomalies. And in certain verses, their trace bleeds through the veil, too faint to name, but too ancient to erase. Cain's fear, after Abel's murder, hints at other Sothers already alive. "Whoever finds me will kill me," he says in Genesis 4:14. But who? Adam's children had barely begun. The text does not explain, because explanation would unravel everything. The Nephilim too are called men of renown from ancient days. No father is listed, no tribe, only the echo of a beginning before the beginning. These are not just symbols, they are fractures in the narrative, shadows of a bloodline not born of Adam. And perhaps this is why God gave Adam dominion, why he sealed Eden behind sword and flame. Not to protect man from evil, but to protect the line of memory from the ones who came before. The forbidden race still wandered, but outside the covenant, they were no longer counted as part of creation. And so they became the unspoken other, not demon, not angel, not fallen, just excluded. And exclusion from covenant is a kind of death far deeper than judgment, for it carries no name, no record, no resurrection. They were the blood that moved without witness, the life that pulsed outside of history. And though Adam's sons filled the earth, they were not the only ones who walked it. Somewhere beyond the garden, the first race remained not blessed, not cursed, but forgotten by design. The silence between Genesis 1 and 2, between the closing line of Genesis 1 and the opening act of Genesis 2, lies a chasm deeper than most dare to see. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. Genesis 1:31. Then silence, a cosmic breath. No time is measured, no history unfolds. And then, a new beginning, as if nothing came before. Genesis 2 does not resume the story. It restarts it. New setting, new tone, new method. No longer does God speak man into being. Now he forms him from dust, breathes into his nostrils, and plants a garden eastward in Eden. This is not the continuation of the first creation, it is a second shaping, deliberate and divergent. The transition is too sudden, too stark. Genesis 1 gives humanity no name. Genesis 2 gives us Adam. The first is formed with the rest of creation, male and female, alongside stars and beasts. The second is formed alone, then placed in a walled world, tended and tested. One was part of the world. The other is set apart from it. This is not repetition, this is refinement. A divine revision where God separates not just light from darkness, but chosen from unchosen. The first humans may have been formed in image, but only Adam was formed with intention. The difference lies not in dust, but in destiny. And what stands between those chapters is silence. A silence that bleeds with meaning. No genealogy is listed for those of Genesis 1. No breath, no names, no mention of Eden, of law, of covenant. They vanish not with violence, but with a mission. Scripture continues, but they are left behind. Why does the narrative not account for them? Why does the text move on without mourning, without mention? Because their existence was not meant to remain. They were a first draft, not flawed, but unfitted. When covenant came, so too did forgetting. And in forgetting, a second creation was born. The early Jewish mystics noticed this divide. In their writings, they hinted at generations before Adam, even worlds before this world. Rabbinic tradition calls them the generations of tohu beings, born in desolation, swallowed before they could root. The Bible does not name them, but the silence does. The ancient book of Jubilees speaks of men before the garden. So does Enoch, and even faint echoes in Job, where morning stars sing and sons of God shout for joy. Though Adam is nowhere to be found, Job 38:7, they were there. The veil just no longer allows us to see them. Some say this silence is metaphor, but in Scripture, silence is often a prison. It holds what cannot be named. And between Genesis 1 and 2 lies such a prison, not for sinners, but for the unchosen. Those who bore image without inheritance, memory without memorial. God does not always destroy what he does not use. Sometimes he simply folds it into mystery, like a throne removed but never broken, or a name erased but still feared. The first humans are not mentioned after Genesis 1 because they were placed behind a curtain that no prophet dared draw back. And yet, traces remain. In the fear of Cain, in the legends of giants, in the wanderers without tribes, all are embers from that fire before Eden. The silence between the chapters was not empty. It was full of lives, of blood, of forgotten creation. What we read as Genesis is not the whole story. It is the approved version, the thread chosen to carry covenant. But there were others' lives unraveled, stories untold. The space between the verses is where they wait. Not gone, only veiled. When God hid a people with no name, there are moments in Scripture where absence speaks louder than presence. The first race, formed before Adam, walks silently behind the text, never named, never cursed, never claimed, but their shadow lingers, and shadows only stretch from something real. God does not hide what has no meaning. He hides what reveals too much. The beings of Genesis 1 were not removed because they failed, but because their existence pointed to a truth too disruptive for covenant. That man was not shaped once but twice. The divine narrative could not hold two beginnings. Adam's line had to be pure, traceable, holy. The others, unnamed, unordered, untethered, stood as a contradiction to divine selection. And contradictions are not explained, they are sealed. Enoch speaks of watchers and their fall, but before their descent, he hints at those who were beings who walked the earth but bore no testimony. The Dead Sea Scrolls whisper of creatures formed from earth, yet abandoned. Not demons, not angels, just forgotten flesh. In Mesopotamian tablets, there are tales of humans born before the divine breath was given, builders, farmers, kings. They lived, they ruled, then vanished. Not with flood or fire, but with silence. These myths echo the structure of Genesis, but without Adam. What if these were not myths at all, but fractured memories? If all nations carry legends of first men, unblessed by gods, unremembered by time, perhaps the Bible's silence is not denial, but displacement. The forbidden race did not belong in the sacred scroll, but they belonged to the earth. God's decision to start again with Adam was not because the first were evil, it was because they were unsealed. They bore no signature of heaven, no breath of divine purpose. To remember them would be to open a door into a creation not authored by covenant. And yet, God did not destroy them, he hid them. That alone proves they mattered. In Scripture, what is irrelevant is erased, but what is hidden is protected. Like the tree of life, guarded by flame. Like the name above all names, spoken only in smoke. There are whispers in the Psalms, those who dwell in the shadow of the Almighty, Psalm 91:1. Not under him, not before him, but in his shadow. What if the shadow was cast by something old, something unspoken, something God veiled, even from the prophets? Isaiah speaks of people who are not a people, Isaiah 65:1. Paul quotes it again in Romans. Who are these? Not Gentiles, for Gentiles are named, not Israel, for they are chosen. These may be the echo, the race without covenant, without law, still wandering beyond the reach of both. In hiding them, God preserved Eden's narrative. He ensured the line of Adam would shine undiluted, but what he veiled did not vanish. They walked outside the garden, beyond the rivers, into lands unclaimed by the chosen. Lands like Nod, where Cain fled and feared being found. And who did he fear? The question rings louder than any answer. No one answers it, because to answer would acknowledge the others. And Scripture, in its holy construction, was not built to contain their names. But creation remembers. So do the mountains, the ruins, the rivers that still bear names older than Eden. They carry the memory of a people with no altar, no law, no voice, but with presence. Presence too deep to erase, too old to name. To hide a people is to fear what they reveal, and perhaps what they reveal is this: that God's first image was not his final one, that before covenant, before obedience, there was existence. And existence, once breathed into flesh, does not vanish, it waits. The day Adam replaced the forgotten. Adam was not made because the others failed. He was made because they remembered. The first race walked the earth in silence, but it was not ignorance that made them dangerous. It was memory. They bore no law, but they bore the trace of the hands that shaped them. And in that memory they carried too much resemblance to God. When God formed Adam from the dust, it was not new material. It was the same earth. But this time, he breathed. This time, he commanded. This time, he sealed the act with boundary and purpose. Adam was not humanity's first form, he was its first containment. The first race needed no exile, because they were never welcomed into Eden. But Adam was placed there with intention, then driven out with consequence. That act exile made him part of the divine story. Not just shaped, but judged. Not just alive, but accountable. This distinction marks the difference between creation and covenant. The first race was made in image, but without instruction. Adam was made in image and then given law. That law is what tied him to heaven and to history. Without it, memory becomes a threat. And so Adam replaces them not with superiority, but with structure. He is not more holy, but more manageable. He lives under watch. He fails under conditions. He sins in a way that can be named, traced, corrected. The others never sinned, because there was no law to break. This is why Adam's genealogy matters. It is the framework of heaven's covenant. Each name is a seal, each generation a continuation of divine order. The first race had no such structure. They multiplied without being counted, moved without being recorded existence, without accountability. Cain's story reveals the fracture. After killing Abel, he fears vengeance not from Adam's family but from others. And yet, no others have been mentioned. Who was Cain afraid of? His fear betrays a truth, that the earth was not empty, and Adam's line was not alone. But instead of reconciling the timelines, the text moves on. Cain is marked, he departs, he builds a city. All of this occurs while Adam's generations are barely beginning. The only way this sequence makes sense is if Adam's line was inserted into an already populated earth. Adam is the covenantal beginning, not the biological one. He is the starting point of a chosen line, not the only line. His presence signals a divine decision to remember one branch and seal away the rest. His breath carries the authority of heaven. Theirs did not. This is why his story begins not with his life, but with the breath. and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Genesis 2-7. The others were flesh. Adam was soul. That soul made him the center of memory, and the others the forgotten perimeter. And yet, even after Adam, the echoes return. Giants appear, ancient men of renown. Whole nations without ancestry suddenly fill the land. God orders their destruction not for their wickedness, but for their origin, for being something that did not belong within the covenant's bounds. This was not about moral failure, it was about narrative purity. The story had been rewritten around Adam, and anything older, anything that survived the first shaping, was now a threat to the structure. Adam's role was not to create order, it was to enforce it by existing within it. The day Adam was formed was not the beginning of mankind. It was the beginning of remembrance. From that point, only those within his line would be named, judged, blessed, or cursed. The others, they continued, but without history, without altar, without future. The forbidden line that reappears in Scripture, the forgotten race, was not erased by wrath, but by silence. Yet silence does not erase completely. Throughout the Scriptures, faint traces remain not as doctrine, but as disturbance, glimpses of a bloodline that was never meant to return, yet never fully vanished. Genesis speaks of Nephilim beings, mighty and ancient, men of renown, Genesis 6-4. They arrive without ancestry, without explanation, sons of God mingling with daughters of men. But what if this union was not entirely new? What if it was the return of a line that had no covenant, only memory? The Nephilim are not the origin, they are resurgence, echoes of flesh that predates Adam, awakened through unlawful merging. The flood was not just a judgment on wickedness, it was a purge, an attempt to drown what should never have stirred beneath the genealogical sea. And yet, after the flood, they appear again. In Numbers, spies sent into Canaan report giants. We were like grasshoppers in their sight. Numbers 13:33. Rephaim, Anakim, Emim, tribes whose roots are never traced back to Noah or to Adam. The forbidden line survived, not as individuals but as fragments. Deuteronomy commands total destruction of some nations, not for sin, but for who they are. God commands Israel to show them no mercy. Deuteronomy 7-2. These are not mere enemies. They are uncountable others, descendants of a bloodline that escaped history's record. The prophet Amos speaks of the Amorites as tall as cedars. Amos 2-9. Goliath stands 6 cubits tall, his spear like a weaver's beam. These are not literary flourishes, they are interruptions, sudden intrusions of a race that does not fit the Adamic mold because they never came from it. Even Jesus encounters a figure in the Gospels known only as the man among the tombs, unchained, unclean, forgotten by society. When asked his name, he replies, "Legion, for we are many." Mark 5-9. It is a moment not just of possession, but of fragmentation, the cry of something ancient that was never meant to be seen again. Isaiah mourns a people not called by my name. Isaiah 65-1. Peter speaks of spirits in prison who disobeyed long ago, in the days of Noah. 1 Peter 3:19-20. Jude references beings who left their proper dwelling. Jude 1-6. These are not myths, they are cracks in the sealed narrative. The existence of these remnants reveals a truth too great to ignore. The forbidden race was never truly destroyed. It was scattered, broken, diluted but not erased. And the further humanity strayed from Eden, the more these fragments re-emerged. They appear not in the line of promise, but on its borders. The Philistines, the Amalekites, the sons of Anak. Not merely enemies, they are theological intrusions. Their presence reminds us that Adam's replacement did not bury the past completely. And perhaps this is why genealogies matter so much in Scripture. To be counted is to be safe. To be named is to be remembered within covenant. But what of those who live outside the scroll? Those who walk, war, and fall but are never listed? They are not allegory, they are residue. The forbidden line reappears where memory fails, in deserts, in tombs, in bloodlines, too tangled to trace. And in moments when the veil thins, when a name is spoken that does not belong, or when a body stands too tall, too silent, too ancient. Scripture does not explain them, because it cannot. Their presence is not a story, it is a warning, that what was buried before Eden still moves beneath us, not in full, not in strength, but in fragments that remember a shaping older than Adam. They were never cursed, never named, never held the law or broke it. Yet their very existence had to be hidden because their memory contradicted the story heaven chose to tell. Not evil, not fallen, just too early, too free, too close to the truth. Adam was not the first breath drawn from dust, only the first breath God chose to remember. And from that memory came covenant, exile, redemption. But what came before him still waits, uninvited, beneath the soil of forgotten lands and ancient fears. They were shaped but never called, alive yet never recorded. And Scripture's silence is not erasure, it is containment. For what God veiled, he did not destroy. And what he buried still trembles in the dark between verses. If these truths are stirring something within you, a sense that the story of creation holds deeper shadows than we've been told, then follow that feeling. There are more veils to lift, more names to uncover, more beginnings that were buried before Genesis ever began. Subscribe to unveil what was sealed. Watch and remember, not everything God made was meant to stay silent.